Modern RPGs are built with hand-holding in mind. Now most new RPGs are technically impressive, but once you understand how they actually function, it becomes hard to unsee what modern design has gradually lost. RPGs from the PS1 era don't smooth out their edges or protect you from your own decisions. They were built in an era where people were able to put their passion and creativity into their creations, rather than be hamstrung by corporate overlords. Alundra is frequently mislabeled as a Zelda-like, and that surface comparison has hidden its true nature for decades. Beneath its bright colors and fantasy presentation lies one of the most psychologically heavy and mechanically demanding RPGs ever released on the PlayStation. This is a game about trauma, despair, and irreversible consequence. You play as Alundra, a dreamwalker capable of entering the nightmares of dying villagers. These dream sequences are not abstract metaphors. They are full puzzle dungeons that expose the fears, regrets, and unresolved guilt of the people you are trying to save. And here's the part modern RPGs refuse to do. You can fail. And when you do, those villagers die permanently. Entire quest lines disappear. The town changes. Shops close. Characters vanish. The world remembers what you couldn't fix. Its puzzle design is legendary for a reason. There is no hint system, no minimap assistance, no safety net. Dungeons are labyrinths, traps are brutal, and progress requires genuine spatial reasoning and observation. The game does not want you comfortable. It wants you attentive. Many modern RPGs would collapse under the difficulty of the dungeon design alone. Tone is shockingly dark. Themes of suicide, grief, betrayal, and psychological collapse are not subtext. They're central pillars of a narrative. The game builds its entire world around the emotional weight of loss. And unlike modern RPGs that quickly reward or reassure, Alundra allows silence, aftermath, and emotional damage to linger. It is not just underrated. It represents a design philosophy that modern RPGs largely abandoned. Breath of Fire 3 structures progression around permanence rather than power fantasy. Character growth is deliberately slow and shaped by a mentorship system that permanently alters stat curves, skill access, and long-term role identity. You are not simply leveling up. You are committing to developmental paths that cannot be easily undone. Combat appears traditional on the surface, but it is governed by disciplined resource flow, formation logic, and attrition management. Enemy scaling remains relevant across the entire campaign, preventing the late-game trivialization common to many JRPGs. Battles reward patience, positioning, and sustain party balance rather than burst damage cycles. The narrative reinforces this structural restraint. It centers on memory, displacement, and the slow reconstruction of identity. Time passes visibly within the world, reframing growth as maturity rather than empowerment. Characters age, relationships shift, and entire regions evolve as the story unfolds. Its reputation has always reflected that integrity. Known for its atmosphere, pacing, and mechanical cohesion, it was loved while acknowledging its restrained momentum. Some players found its discipline demanding, but others recognized it as purposeful. Breath of Fire 3 stands as a reminder that permanence creates meaning, and that consequence, not convenience, is what makes progression feel real. Vagrant Story does not behave like a conventional RPG. It behaves like a closed mechanical ecosystem disguised as an action game. Every major system feeds into another. Weapon composition, enemy anatomy, spell affinity, risk management, and equipment degradation are all interdependent. You're not meant to improvise your way through encounters. You're meant to understand how the world is assembled and how your tools interact with it. The game offers very little onboarding, and mistakes made early can quietly undermine your effectiveness long after you have moved on. Combat is slow, precise, and unforgiving. Enemies are divided into anatomical zones, each with different resistances and vulnerabilities. Using the wrong weapon type does not simply lower your damage. It can invalidate your entire approach. Buffs, debuffs, and the invisible risk gauge govern whether your attacks remain reliable or begin to collapse. Even basic encounters can punish sloppy preparation, and the game makes it clear that mastery is not optional. It expects analysis rather than reaction. Progression reinforces that philosophy. You do not outscale the world. You become more exact within it. Weapons are modular, spells layer into persistent effects, and every build choice has permanent consequences. You are not rewarded for speed or aggression, but for consistency and foresight. Equipment degradation, durability management, and affinity balancing quietly shape how you survive long-term. Its reception has always been polarized. Critics praised its ambition, mechanical density, and artistic direction, while many players found its opacity and pacing difficult to penetrate. In 2026, that density reads less like a flaw and more like structural integrity. Vagrant's story is not designed to be convenient. It is designed to be coherent. And that coherence is exactly why it still outclasses many modern RPG systems. Parasite Eve frames itself as a cinematic thriller, but its underlying structure is far closer to a tactical survival RPG than a traditional action game. Combat unfolds in real time, yet is governed by invisible turn logic that forces deliberate pacing. You are constantly managing distance, ability cooldowns, and enemy threat zones, even when the interface does not explicitly surface those systems. Positioning is not cosmetic, it directly governs survival. Encounters are built around attrition rather than spectacle. Ammunition, healing items, and special abilities drain slowly across the campaign, and careless victories can compromise your momentum hours later. Enemies are designed to pressure your movement and resource usage rather than simply test reaction speed. You are encouraged to conserve, reposition, and disengage, not to overwhelm. Progression is tightly bound to preparation. Weapon modification is permanent. Armor choices meaningfully alter resistances, and parasite energy abilities define your long-term approach to combat. The game never allows you to trivialize its systems. Even late-game encounters demand awareness, spacing, and resource discipline. Its reception reflected that unusual hybrid design. It was praised for its originality, atmosphere, and mechanical cohesion, while some resisted its restrained pacing and survival emphasis. In 2026, Parasite Eve feels less like an experimental oddity and more like a lost design path. It does not chase speed or spectacle. It quietly demands understanding. And in doing so, it exposes how much modern RPGs simplify by comparison. Suikoden 2 does not emphasize spectacle. It emphasizes structure. Its world is built around political instability, shifting alliances and consequence loops that reshape regions rather than individual storylines. Progress is not measured through domination, but through consolidation, recruiting allies, stabilizing territories, and navigating moral compromises. Combat is fast and readable, but it exists primarily to serve larger systemic goals. Army battles, one-on-one duels, and standard encounters form a layered mechanical ecosystem rather than a single gameplay loop. You are managing an expanding network rather than a party, and your decisions ripple outward into recruitment, economy, and regional control. Progression is slow, deliberate, and reputation-based. Characters are not interchangeable, and losing allies carries narrative and mechanical cost. The game does not reward grinding. It rewards planning, relationship management, and political awareness. Success is defined less by damage output and more by stability. Its reputation has only strengthened over time. Critics praised its storytelling, cast, and systemic cohesion, while some players initially underestimated its restraint. In 2026, Suikoden 2 stands as one of the clearest examples of an RPG that valued consequence over spectacle. and it continues to expose how shallow many modern progression systems have become. Xenogears presents itself as a traditional JRPG on the surface, but beneath that familiar structure sits one of the most mechanically and philosophically ambitious systems ever built into an RPG. Combat, character growth, and narrative progression are tightly interwoven, and none of them are designed to be consumed passively. The game expects attention, interpretation, and long-term commitment rather than comfort. It does not rush the player into power. It slowly conditions them into understanding. Its battle system blends turn-based command selection with positional awareness and ability chaining. Death blows are not simply learned. They are discovered through repeated use, creating a progression model based on behavior rather than menus. Mech combat operates under an entirely separate rule set, forcing players to manage fuel, altitude, and equipment loadouts. You're never allowed to rely on a single mechanical language for too long. Narratively, this rejects heroic clarity. It leans heavily into cycles of violence, ideological conflict, and metaphysical consequence. Characters are shaped by belief systems rather than destiny arcs, and choices are often framed as philosophical alignments rather than personal victories. The story is willing to be dense, unresolved, and emotionally uncomfortable. Reception has always reflected that ambition. Critics praised its scale, narrative depth, and mechanical originality while acknowledging its pacing irregularities and late-game structural compression. In 2026, Xenogears feels less like a relic and more like a reminder that RPGs were once allowed to be intellectually demanding rather than narratively efficient. Final Fantasy Tactics does not treat combat as a puzzle to be solved once and mastered forever. It treats it as a system that continues to resist you the deeper you go. Every unit, class, and skill choice permanently reshapes your long-term options, and the game offers very little protection from inefficient planning. You are not building a party. You are constructing an ecosystem of interlocking roles that must function under pressure. Positioning, elevation, facing, and turn order quietly dictate every engagement. Damage numbers are secondary to control. A single poorly positioned unit can collapse an entire formation, and recovery is often slow or impossible without sacrificing momentum. Progression is not about power spikes, but about structural stability, building parties that can survive unpredictable enemy behavior rather than dominate it. Narratively, the game rejects heroic framing. Its political drama centers on class conflict, corruption, and ideological fracture. Characters are shaped by circumstance rather than prophecy, and victories rarely feel clean. The story reinforces the mechanical reality that power destabilizes as much as it resolves. Its reception has always reflected that dual identity. Its tactical depth and narrative ambition are its greatest strength, but its learning curve and punishing difficulty spikes can be a negative. Nowadays, FF Tactics feels less like an old masterpiece and more like a living blueprint, one that modern tactical RPGs still struggle to match structurally. Legend of Legaia disguises its mechanical rigor beneath a familiar adventure structure, but its internal systems are far more disciplined than they initially appear. Combat revolves around input-based art chains that demand deliberate planning rather than reactive button presses. You are not choosing single commands. You are constructing attack sequences that shape risk, recovery, and damage flow. Every encounter quietly tests how well you understand your own inputs. Enemy design reinforces that restraint. Status effects, elemental affinities, and defensive behaviors require adaptation rather than repetition. Grinding offers diminishing returns, and careless chaining can expose your party to momentum collapse. Progress is built through consistency rather than escalation, and mastery is earned by internalizing enemy patterns and resource timing. Narratively, the game leans into isolation and recovery rather than conquest. The world is broken by mist, Villages are cut off, and survival depends on rebuilding connectivity rather than defeating singular threats. The story frames progress as restoration instead of domination, reinforcing its mechanical philosophy. Reception has always been rather underrated. At release, critics praised its unique combat and atmosphere, while noting its restrained pacing and conservative structure. Now, Legend of Legaia remains a reminder that innovation does not need spectacle, it needs cohesion. Chrono Cross appears colorful and melodic, but its internal systems are unusually restrained and conceptually heavy. Combat is governed by a stamina-based turn economy rather than traditional MP, forcing players to weigh every action against future vulnerability. You're never simply choosing what to do. You're choosing what you will be unable to do afterward. Progression avoids linear stat growth. Characters gain strength through narrative milestones rather than grinding, and party composition is driven more by story alignment than optimization. The game discourages repetition and minimizes mechanical inflation, keeping tension intact even as the world expands. Narratively, it leans heavily into identity, memory, and consequence across timelines. Choices echo across alternate realities, often without emotional closure. The story resists tidy resolution, mirroring its mechanical refusal to reward brute force progression. Its reception has always been polarized. It was praised for its music, atmosphere, and philosophical ambition, while some players struggled with its fragmented narrative and understated systems. Chrono Cross stands as one of the clearest examples of an RPG that valued cohesion over convenience. And unfortunately, its design philosophy remains unpopular. Koudelka is not remembered as often as the RPG giants that followed it, but that is precisely what makes it so tempting to revisit in 2026. Released in 1999, this game quietly pioneered an entire subgenre that modern studios still struggle to replicate: survival horror role-playing. Set almost entirely inside a decaying Welsh monastery, it strips away heroic fantasy and replaces it with isolation, psychological pressure, and genuine resource scarcity. Healing items are limited, enemy encounters are deliberately uncomfortable, and every corridor feels like it might cost you something you cannot afford to lose. Combat unfolds on a tactical grid, but unlike later tactical RPGs, Koudelka refuses to make combat empowering. Your party members are fragile. Positioning matters, enemy attacks feel dangerous, and retreat is often the smartest option. Mistakes do not simply lower numbers. They erode your ability to continue. The game actively trains you to think like someone trapped. Narratively, this leans heavily into psychological horror. Its cast is deeply flawed, uncomfortable, and emotionally volatile. Dialogue is sharp, personal, and grounded in fear rather than destiny. The story explores trauma, obsession, and guilt in ways that feel closer to pathologic than Final Fantasy, and it never rushes to comfort the player. You're often left sitting with consequences rather than being guided past them. Modern RPGs rarely dare to make players feel unsafe. This is built entirely around that discomfort. Its camera angles, sound design, and oppressive pacing constantly remind you that survival is conditional. And that design philosophy is exactly why Koudelka still humiliates modern horror RPGs that are afraid to let players fail meaningfully.